Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Antonio Wendland. I'm the Associate Director for the Harvard's Program on Education Policy and Governance. I wanted to remind everyone that these proceedings are being recorded and are available on our website for viewing after the event. I also would like to encourage everyone to ask questions in the Q&A panel. And we also have a chat for folks to speak amongst each other. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Professor Paul Peterson, Henry Lee Shattuck Professor of Government here at Harvard University and Director of the Program on Education Policy and Governance. Paul?
Thank you, Antonio, and thanks to all of you for being with us again today for the fourth session of our conference entitled Should School Boards Run Schools? And the focus of today's gathering is, do school boards govern or are they rubber stamps? I think when I first began studying school boards, it was conventional wisdom that they didn't do much of anything except approve of anything the superintendent wanted to do or fired the superintendent. So they only did one thing or maybe nothing at all. Now, I think understanding of the role of the school boards has changed since then. So I don't think that's necessarily the point of view that most people have, but it's still a topic worthy to consider. How significant are the school boards as part of the governing arrangements of our educational system? So I'm very pleased to have with me as co-moderator of the conference, Michael Hartney, who is a professor at Boston College and also a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. So Michael and I are going to share the moderating responsibilities, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael now to introduce our speakers for today.
Great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to everyone for joining us. We have three terrific speakers lined up today. The first will be Robin Lake. Robin directs the Center on Reinventing Public Education, otherwise known as CERPI, at Arizona State University. CERPI is a nonpartisan research and policy organization that helps to develop evidence-based solutions for American public education. Since its founding in the early 90s, it's played a leading role in shaping debates over education reform, particularly on issues related to school choice and education governance reform, topics which make Robin particularly well-suited to addressing today's questions about school board leadership. After Robin presents, we're privileged then to hear from AJ Crabill. AJ wears many hats, but I think it's fair to say that he's now the nation's leading school board governance coach, helping district leaders figure out how to build student-centered blueprints for their decision-making. AJ served as deputy commissioner at the Texas Education Agency, and he's also worked with the Council of Great City Schools. Very recently, he's the author of an excellent new book, which I recommend to all of you. You can see it here, entitled Great on Their Behalf: Why School Boards Fail and How Yours Can Become Effective. Finally, we'll hear from Michael Ford. Michael is an associate professor of public administration at the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, where he also directs the Whitburn Center for Governance and Policy Research. And I know Michael's worked well. He's conducted numerous surveys of both school board members and superintendents. And we're hoping today he will draw on some of those research findings to help us inform our question of the day on whether school boards are rubber stamps or whether they govern. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Robin.
Thank you, Michael. And thanks to Paul and the whole crew for having us today. This is a terrific conversation. Looking forward to it. All right, so what I want to do is to inform our question about rubber stamping or governing, I want to bring in some data. And throughout the pandemic, we have been tracking data about how school districts are responding. We've seen a lot of politics, not science necessarily, driving decisions. But today I want to dig into some data that we've been collecting with our colleagues at RAND. And I would say that, we're looking at district surveys and teacher surveys, and the bottom line here for the purpose of our conversation is what we're hearing from these leaders is, well, no, not a lot of rubber stamping going on, not a lot of governing either, but rather a lot of interference and noise that's really distracting from folks' ability to serve students during the pandemic effectively. And right now, as we turn to recovery, I think we see the trends continuing. Don't need to tell you all how urgent it is that we work on behalf of students right now. All right, so we need to belabor the headlines. I will remind all of us that politics is not a new situation in education, right? So the question is, has it gotten a lot worse, and what's the reality on the ground? So we're going to look into some data on that front. We want to know in particular, how is it affecting folks' ability to respond? All right, so let me tell you a little bit about our source data. Just, mentioned we're doing some surveys with RAND. This is part of the American School District Panel, a nationally representative survey of district leaders across the country. I'm going to be drawing from the most recent data, but also looking backwards. We actually started the survey in 2020, so we have some historical data. We complement that data with interviews on the ground with superintendents and their teams. I'll also touch a little bit on some teacher surveys that RAND's been doing, not too much there, but just to give you a little bit of that sense. All right, so what's going on out there? What are folks seeing? Well, won't surprise any of you, I think, to know that what we hear from district leaders, they say over and over again that politics have been interfering with their ability to attend to schooling. And what I'm showing you here is health and safety data. So when we asked superintendents if they agreed or strongly agreed that politics were getting in the way, and specifically around safety and vaccination during COVID-19, you can see that the rates in fall of 21 were kind of astoundingly high. 74% of superintendents said that there was interference going on. This was an issue for them. And that's diminished over time, but it's still pretty significant in the latest surveys. And that, one superintendent said, to this question of has it gotten worse? Well, politics showed up closer to the boardroom than they have since the late 60s. And we saw this all over the place during the height of the pandemic. But let me tell you some more recent survey data. The district leaders more recently have been telling us that other issues have been taking the place of safety and vaccines, LGBTQ+ issues, critical race theories. So about 50% are saying that these are issues that are getting in their way. And, what does it matter? Well, it's translating into some tangible issues on the ground. If you go over to the right side, I thought that these results were pretty interesting and alarming. Actual physical threats against educators. About a third of educators said they were experiencing that. We're talking about the influence of boards, but boards also can be the focus or the target of politicization, and we're seeing threats against board members being reported on the ground as well. And then, nothing so scary, but on the left-hand side, the FOIA requests, the opt-out requests, the request to remove books, curriculum from libraries or classrooms are continuing, according to district leaders, at a very significant rate. About half of district leaders are saying they're dealing with heightened FOIA requests. Is this a problem? Well, it takes away from teaching and learning and the attention on the core goals of education, potentially. Okay, so when we broke down results, looking at who's reporting these issues, they're coming mostly from historically advantaged school districts, and by that we are generally looking at majority white districts represented in the dark blue here. So you can see higher rates of reporting on the types of issues that I just talked about, and that's consistent around more affluent districts. This translates into, in many cases, red states versus blue states around these issues. I want to say, though, we presented these results to some superintendents yesterday, and many of them were from urban districts, majority, minority districts, and they said, well, yeah, I mean, these issues in particular are heightened in these districts, but we're dealing with different issues. We're dealing with unionization issues. We're dealing with board politics that are wrapped up in those kinds of questions. And so these issues may be new to more suburban, more affluent districts, but welcome to the party. In general, when we talked about governing with superintendents, they were emphasizing like school boards have an important role to play in governance, and we're just not seeing that happening. In fact, we're seeing them exacerbate the issues, not govern toward outcomes. And so their concern was that people are being elected to school boards based on culture war concerns and are just not understanding their role in their broader responsibilities. So board members are operating as independent actors, not functioning as a governance team. It's creating chaos and leaves learning to chance. And I'll just point out that these issues were coming up at the state level as well, where school districts were finding that they're in the middle of amplification of conflict and just hunkering down and doing what they can to survive. All right, so why should we care? Is this just political theater? Well, superintendents are telling us again and again, they have to focus on district priorities around teaching and learning right now. They cannot be putting out fires constantly. Fires are part of their job, but now this is an all-consuming experience for them. And importantly, I think the teacher surveys are showing heightened fear and anxiety. We know there are teacher shortage, teacher attraction issues right now in the labor market. Maybe this is contributing to more difficulties on that front. And so superintendents are telling us, I need to be more creative and nimble than I've ever had to be before. This is always an intense pressure job, but it's getting worse. And I guess the last data that I'll show you before we just start wrapping up is, this may be affecting the superintendency. We asked a question of district leaders about reasons that they'd consider leaving their job. And this is a long list of issues that we asked about, but the darker green is showing you the issues that superintendents said are considered, really leading them to think, and maybe now's the time to get out of this position and do something differently. Job-related stress in general shows up there. Whether you can trace it back to school boards or not, I don't know. But there's a whole cluster of questions that are showing up in dark green around the middle here. That's showing political divisions in the community, school board relations. All of that adds up to a picture of, this is really influencing superintendents' desire to continue in this position. All right, so I think the bright light in our data is that district leaders tell us regularly that they're finding ways to take action to help reduce the strife and board relations that they're dealing with, developing relationships, not bending to independent issues. We heard some really, really creative approaches. And so there's some good things that we've documented in the research about what superintendents can do to manage these kinds of tensions. But in general, we have to get more specific about how we're going to deal with this. And I think first and foremost on my list is superintendents really need to be trained to be able to manage community politics. They're not going away anytime soon. And we've got to give superintendents better assistance in figuring out how to manage all of this. But then, really when it comes to board governance, AJ's job is critical. We've got to train prospective board members on their responsibilities and the consequences of polarization for kids. North Dakota actually has been investing a fair amount of their ESSER dollars in board training, which is something for states to look at. But I'll also say that I think my colleagues, Paul Hill and Ashley Jockum, have really been pushing thinking and have written a book about maybe we need to think about defining the job of board differently. So limiting or channeling the scope of authority the school boards have to reduce the single issue candidates' dominance, or at least reduce the harm that they can do. So that's worth us discussing in the time that we've got. And I'll just say the research is pretty thin on how this is all playing out on the ground. I'd like to just drop the idea of more evidence building around board politics in here. And I will turn to my colleagues now. And I'll just say that if you want to go deeper into the data and the issues, here are some resources for you.
Great. Well, thank you, Robin. AJ, the floor is yours.
A little disappointing. I was hoping for a significant body of controversy, but I don't have a whole lot of disagreement with what Robin laid out. The evidence here is pretty consistent with the experience on the ground. Work from folks like Jason Grissom looking at does more discord actually contribute to collective decision-making? Not surprisingly, the answer seems to be no, it doesn't. Work from Kogan, who seems to be with us here in the audience today, do these type of large cultural flare-ups in the boardroom tend to contribute to improvements in student outcomes? Perhaps not surprisingly, suggests that they probably don't. The thing that I focus on with the school boards that I work with across the country, what matters most is how are we focusing our time and energy? And so your framing of the conversation is this whole rubber stamping question actually doesn't squarely, for me, hit the issue on the head. What matters is the board actually demonstrating its use of time that a focus on improving student outcomes is what is most cherished in our school system? And if it is, a board can demonstrate that by investing a significant amount of its time. Our coaching is they spend at least half of their time each month really digging into what are our goals for students, what do we want them to know and be able to do, and to what extent are they growing in that area. And so all the issues that Robin lays out, notably, none of them match that description. None of those are discussions about are students actually growing. And so the challenge is when boards focus on these other things, then superintendents start to focus on other things. To me, that is a much more kind of dangerous phenomenon in terms of creating organizational alignment around student outcomes, is that you just abolish the likelihood that anyone's actually going to be paying attention to the things that matter most. Whether or not board members are in alignment with their superintendent isn't my biggest concern. It's will they be focused on the things that are going to make the biggest difference for students? And when they do, then if people call that rubber stamping, I'm actually perfectly okay with that. But that pejorative to me is anachronistic. That's not where the ball game is. That, to me, that's an old conversation, along with the conversation with micromanagement, which I also think is anachronistic. I think where the ball is today is how are we spending time? Are we focused on the things that matter most? And as the board gets focused on that, that frees the superintendent up to focus on that. To the data that Robin presents, that means the job of the board is just shifted a little bit, that the board has to be more willing to dial in and be focused in the face of pressures to look into all of these other areas. And boards have this misalignment of incentives because they certainly tend to want to get reappointed or reelected. And it often feels like the path to that is to lean into all the type of issues that Robin's data lifts up. The argument that I make with school boards across the nation, and I think our experience backs it up, is that nothing succeeds like success. That when you can actually show that we're focused on student outcomes, we're actually putting points on the boards for children, that very frequently you can win the long conversation on these things, and that you don't have to feel completely kidnapped by whatever the culture issue of the day is, that there is actually a path to political success that leads through actually making sure that you're focused on student learning and creating a system that's aligned to that and letting the results speak for themselves, going out and pushing those results as a counter to a focus on the types of issues that Robin sources. The one other thing that I would mention is I tend to agree with her completely on the impact that I'm seeing that these type of conversations are having on superintendent longevity, that the more that these issues are at the center of the conversation rather than student learning at the center of the conversation, I would expect that we should see an increase in superintendent turnover, not a decrease. But I certainly look forward to hearing ideas from Ford, as well as chopping it up with folks in the audience.
Great. Michael?
Yes, thank you, other Michael. I think there's 3 Michaels on here. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, AJ. All really good stuff. And I guess I'll start by saying that politics on school boards is nothing new. So I appreciate the nuance being brought here today, because we shouldn't fear politics if it's productive. And I think that really is one of the great challenges we have, is how do we get school boards to focus on the debates that are actually productive and that reflect the divided values of their community, as opposed to these national issues that school boards really don't have a lot of control over. So to that end, really happy that we're talking about what school boards actually do and what they don't do. I find we get caught up in these macro governance debates. So we talk about school choice, democratic control, different funding models. These are all things that matter, things that are important, but we don't talk enough about what school boards are actually doing at the micro level. So you'll find there's a lot of variation that makes easy answers difficult, especially when we have over 13,000 school boards in the United States. So when I saw the title of today's presentation, I immediately thought, well, yes and no. There are certainly some boards that are rubber stamps. I've encountered those. Some are not. Some are only rubber stamps for certain things. And sometimes that's a function of the state governing environment. You have states where the fiscal decision-making, like Michigan, for example, is really constricted for school boards. So on the finance stuff, they are kind of rubber stamps, but that's more of a design or a function of context as opposed to a choice. So some of the data I've looked at over the years, I did a recent survey, well, a couple of years ago now, of Wisconsin superintendents. So just one state, but when I asked them about their board dynamics, about 80% say they have a very cooperative board, 22% say they have a high conflict board, and 60% say they have a very productive board. So again, the theme of the day, a lot of variation, but even within those terminologies, conflict is complex. There can be really productive conflict that's focused on improving academic achievement. There can be negative conflict types like relationship conflict, where board members just don't like each other and they're getting distracted. To Robin's point about some of these national issues that are coming up at school board meetings, that's a classic example of non-productive conflict. I'm thinking of an anecdote here during our last school board races here in Wisconsin. There was a debate where there's a board member saying that they get elected, they're going to eliminate critical race theory. You have the superintendent of the district come out and say, well, we don't have critical race theory. The board member or the person running for the board says, well, if I'm elected, I'm going to eliminate it. Right? There's nowhere for the superintendent to go in that situation. They're having a conflict over something that's totally divorced from the governing task. I'll note when I ask school board members about their dynamics on their board, I get the same answers, right? All kinds of variation about the levels of conflict and cooperation. Disagreement about the impact of partisan politics. There are folks who think that, we should identify as a Democrat or a Republican because that telegraphs to residents, exactly where we stand on issues. You have others that say, no, that's a distraction. That's a baked in conflict point that's going to move us in a different direction or a bad direction. But again, my broader point here is that we have so much variation that I think we have to ask more nuanced questions. I also want to point out that the governing task doesn't stop and start during board deliberations. I know I've seen some studies that look at rubber stamps and they tend to look at divided votes and things that are going on within the board meeting. But what actually happens on school boards is so much more than what's occurring during a meeting. And we can certainly debate about the impact that has on transparency, but often a board that might appear to be a rubber stamp is a function of board members and superintendents doing their homework ahead of time. So when I interview superintendents and school board members across the country, I find that they're frequently interested in having unified votes whenever possible. And they tend to sort that out for the actual meeting. They tend to not bring things to the floor or to the full group unless they have a degree of confidence in the outcome. And again, from a democratic transparency standpoint, that might not be the greatest thing, but I think it also shows the importance of having a high functioning group dynamic, because that's going to bleed over into the governing process far beyond what occurs during an actual meeting. Now, going to some of the things that Robin talked about, I really liked how you framed it about the noise. Now we have to cut through some of this noise and these national partisan culture war issues that can, I guess, derail the governing process. And I like to look at school board governance, and I just did this last week talking to a group of folks in Wisconsin, as a giant game of telephone, which we all played as a kid, right? We're trying to find a unified message from a school board that can be translated to the superintendent, that can be translated to the school, right, principal, school leadership, can eventually bleed into the classroom. I think that's really the thing that can unleash positive academic impacts on school districts. But if we screw up that first step, where we don't have a unified or clear message from the school board, we're not giving the superintendent clear guidance. We're not providing any mechanism for accountability for performance. And we're basically shooting ourselves in the foot before we started. Now, this goes into a broader point about governance being an enabling reform or an enabling action, right? Governance alone is not going to improve academic outcomes, but it's going to make that impactful message possible. A clear message to the superintendent can be understood, implemented, evaluated, and that superintendent can be held accountable. And the end goal here in the governance side is to make the group have a clear identity, a clear conception of itself, and to be stronger than the sum of its parts. So I guess really in conclusion, at least in my little section here, I think we need to keep having this more nuanced discussion about what school boards do, how they do it, and what we think they ought to be doing. Because so many of our critiques on the governance model at the macro level come from the experience of a handful of boards. Things that are interesting, things that are important, but things that don't necessarily translate to the massive diverse group of school boards we have out there. So to that end, how do we improve things? Well, shout out to the Whitburn Center. We have a governance toolkit that we put out there to try to help school boards and local governments in general across the country. But really what we try to do is have a better onboarding process so that school board members walk into that room, that governing context, with an understanding of the basics of school finance, their powers, their roles and responsibility. We have sample alignment statements so that school board members can all get on the same page on what they mean about accountability, what their goals are around academic achievement, what the goals are around their strategic planning process. Have some role definition so that the superintendent understands the scope of their responsibilities on the operations side compared to the scope of the governing responsibilities on the school board side. And then finally, we give them tools to try to identify when the group dynamic falls apart. As I mentioned, conflict, cooperation, productivity, these are really nuanced concepts, but there's a huge body of literature in public administration and psychology, even in the private business literature, about group dynamics and how that impacts performance. So giving school board members the tools to understand when their school board gets sick in a group dynamic, and more importantly, giving them some type of actions they can take to improve their dynamic is incredibly powerful. It also gives them something to do. And that sounds a little, I don't know, that sounds like I'm being mean to school board members, but it's important to channel those energies into those productive things. Because if school board members don't feel like they're making an impact and don't have the tools to be productive, they're going to get sidetracked by these culture war issues or these single issues that really don't have anything to do with the day-to-day of being a school board member. So with that, I'll turn it over to everybody else. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Michael, and thank you all for those excellent opening presentations. You've each illuminated the multiple dimensions that this topic raises. And I'm a little, yes, okay, I sympathize with these board members, with these superintendents that Robin Lake is describing. They're very upset about all the conflict in the community, but I have yet to see school boards and administrators really committing themselves in a deep way to trying to find the best tools available to raise student achievement. It seems like they're much too distracted by other issues out there, such as, and these are important issues, you know, balancing the budget and dealing with the fiscal issues and dealing with the teachers union and dealing with all of the reorganization of the schools that might be required by changing enrollments. So there's an awful lot of other sort of business out there, which you can easily spend your time focusing on. But as AJ and I think Michael Ford both have sort of indicated, there's not a lot of devoted attention by school boards to make sure that the students are learning. So Robin, you didn't talk about that in your presentation, so it would be interesting to see how you, in your questions that you asked, did you pick up anything in this dimension?
No, we didn't ask about that really. Well, you know, I will say when we talk to superintendents about how they're managing the politics, I mean, I told you we heard a lot of really good and effective, seemingly effective strategies from superintendents. What they were doing was essentially that Paul was saying, you know, we need to get this board focused on the right issues, which is, you know, pandemic recovery, addressing the mental health needs of our kids, whatever is going on in our community that's urgent that we need to deal with. And so some of them were, you know, for sure, they were going to their boards and trying to get them oriented around those issues and helping them understand that, you know, is the role of the board. But they were also, some of them were going to colleagues in the community who they thought would be influential on the board. So church leaders, doctors, whoever they could find to be, to kind of help reorient the board around the things that they wanted to be talking about. Some were pretty adept about managing their board agenda so that they actually filled the agenda with certain things that they wanted the board to be talking about and other things that they wanted to just try to steer them away from. But I will say that once upon a time long ago, I went into some state legislation and state constitutions and just looked around to see how are states defining the role of the board, because I was curious, you know, as anybody said, school boards are responsible for managing performance and looking and managing fiscal responsibility. And very, very few states, this is a long time ago, somebody may have done more recent research or more comprehensive research on this, but I saw, you know, everything under the sun about what boards were doing, you know, bicycle safety, this and that, and very little clear guidance that this is your job, board. And I think that's where I think Paul Hill and Ashley Jockham's book is really intriguing, because what they're arguing for is let's define the role of the board very clearly around performance and fiscal management and limit the other things that they can be legislating on.
Any other reactions to that topic? I know you both have addressed it, AJ and Michael.
Yeah, I'm happy to react to that if you'll have me here. I agree with you, Robin, and I guess a question for you. I mean, do you see that as a state function, or as a local function? I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do is push local school boards to adopt you know, policy statement that specifically says their goal is to improve academic achievement, and they can all agree on that. But really, I choose that strategy simply because there is no national, you know, no statewide direction there. So I'm curious how you think logistically is the best way to go about that.
Yeah, it's. I mean, my own opinion is whatever works. If it works at the local level, do it. If the state can help guide that, that's great. And if it can be, you know, put into rules or legislation and, you know, set up as a long-term thing for all of the boards in the state, then hurrah. And I will say that, we're not talking much about states here, but the more states opt out of providing that kind of guidance, providing that kind of focus for school boards, the more local politics will take over. You create a vacuum. So states do have a critical role to play. And for the most part, we've seen them kind of opting out of that role during the pandemic. They really need to provide that cover to superintendents. It's a critical role for them to play. But political cover can come from all different directions. It can come from parent advocacy groups. And so, we've seen parents across the country during the pandemic stepping in and saying, hey, superintendents, we want you to focus on the following, and we're going to influence the school board in that direction. And hopefully the following is teaching and learning.
And I was going to just reiterate that exact same point, is that one of the things I mentioned in a book is we studied all 50 states and looked at their legislative frameworks and expectations for school boards, and found that half of them don't have really any unique requirements for school board members to be trained about what they should be focusing on, what they should be looking at. That just half of the states say nothing on the topic outside of the normal trainings that all elected officials are subject to. And really only 4 states that we could find anywhere in the country actually had something on the books requiring school board members to be trained in and focused on anything related to student outcomes, anything related to what is it that students should know and be able to do. And so I agree to this point that that is also a tangible area that states could lean in, not merely updating education code to clearly articulate that the sole reason school systems exist is to improve outcomes for students, to cause improvements in what children know and are able to do, but then to back that up with having a set of required trainings for board members that ground them in how is it that board members listen to the vision of the community, craft those into goals for what the school system should be focused on, and monitor progress against those goals every single month without fail. Those are tangible things that states can do to help push the needle in the direction of a stronger focus on student outcomes.
So I think there's wide consensus both on the panel and among the moderators that student outcomes are what matter. And so I'm hearing a lot of if a muscular superintendent is getting it done in a district and they're making a lot of decisions, but those decisions are what's good for kids, then more power to you. If there's a district where boards are more involved and it's working well for kids, then that's fine too. And that's why I'd like to ask a very specific question, because I'm not convinced that we shouldn't push more still on this question of role. And I know, AJ, you do take this question up a bit in your book, so I'm sure you'll have thoughts. And what I want to ask about is the pandemic, but not the era when sort of Robin's data, where she's looking at, a year, 2 years after students return to the classroom, but the very specific question of, the summer of 2020, entering the fall, where I think we saw a real stress test of our governance system. Who should have been in the driver's seat in terms of making the decision for that fall of how schools would open and when they would open? Should it have been, it's easy to say it should have been both the board and the superintendent, but perhaps folks could say a little bit more specifically, what is the role of the board in that situation? What is the role of the superintendent? Because I think it's a nice case study for stress testing what sort of governance model is most effective for driving what's best for kids.
So 2 different things on this. One, I think the states where governors stepped up when in the final accounting are going to probably see different results than states where the governor didn't step up. And so the governor stepped forward and said, this is the policy for the state. That takes a lot of pressure off of local superintendents, and they behave in a certain way. And so I think leadership does matter. I think in the final accounting, we'll see that. The other thing I would argue is that does not in any way absolve local actors from making decisions. In my district, we almost didn't talk about the pandemic. You can go back, all of our board meetings are online. Watch them for the past 2 years, watch them for the past 3 years. There's not a lot of discussion about the pandemic. We certainly had expectations that there are people whose job it is to address the very real phenomenon of that. And there are people whose job it is to make sure that appropriate protections are in place and so on and so forth. But the board conversation stayed focused on in the face of all of this, what are we doing to educate children? And never actually let the staff off the hook for saying, we're going to not pay attention to student learning because there's a pandemic on. That is a fundamentally different approach than a lot of people took. Many people said, oh, well, there's a pandemic, so we have to talk about it. We don't have to do anything. What you should be focused on is, are children actually learning? And everything else are circumstances that must be managed. But in the process of managing them, local actors decide, do we make the management of externalities the focus, or do we make student learning the focus? That is a local decision, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But states definitely can take specific actions that increase the likelihood that local actors move in the direction or focus on student outcomes.
Well, we blame parents for raising all these controversial questions, and the divisions and divisiveness that gets in the way of thinking about the really important issues of learning and teaching in the classroom. But you have to be sympathetic to families and that are concerned about these cultural questions. And if they see the school system articulating policies that are really challenging to families that they really disagree with deeply, and yet their children are going to be exposed to those policies at the school, isn't that exactly what you would expect? That you would have a community sort of, or people in a community raising these kinds of concerns. So I don't see how you are going to eliminate cultural conflict spilling over into school board decision-making and school board politics. That's just going to be, as long as we have cultural conflict in our society, we're going to see it in our school boards. So I think there's some sort of wishing for something that's never going to happen being expressed by those.
No, so I'm certainly not recommending that. What you've heard me say is that boards need to spend half their time focused on the thing that matters most. Whatever they choose to spend the other half of their time on, so be it. Each community is a political fingerprint. It's going to be completely unique. They're going to have to decide what they're going to spend their time on. But what should be a non-negotiable is that whether or not children are actually learning is the first priority, and that we focus on that. And so I don't have a problem. I don't problematize parents having a bunch of other issues they're concerned about. I do hope that the system is designed that the superintendent is managing in a way that many of those issues don't make it to the boardroom. But if they do, I don't see a problem with that. The only challenge I'm pushing back on is the pretending that because of these externalities, because of these additional issues that come up, that boards are somehow held hostage and have no agency to remain focused on that which matters most. That's foolishness.
Well, that's a good response. So I haven't, does anybody have a reaction to that? I can think of some reaction. It's nice of you to say 50-50, focus half your time on this and half your time on that, but life is too complicated for that, maybe.
No, what you're saying is there's inherent weakness in leadership. That's what needs to be solved for. But no, there are always going to be complications. You're dealing with children. It's not like they show up in cookie cutter prints that are easy to manage. What the reality is, leaders still get to choose how to use their time. And leaders will either make the choice, we're going to focus on the things that are going to drive performance improvements for our students and really position our students to succeed, or we're going to get caught up in the other things. And that is always a choice. And I have absolutely no empathy for anyone who wants to pretend it's not a choice. That leaders do have a choice, they do have agency, and those choices do in fact matter, that the choices they make for children actually do matter. And that's a beautiful thing. It suggests that there's some value to having school boards at all, that they really can be transforming the lives of children. But that transformation will come at a cost. And either board members will pay the political cost, or they will step out of the way and children will pay it on their behalf. That is the choice that they have.
Well said, AJ. Folks don't mind. I could talk for a long time on this, and I'm going to sound a little negative. But first, to your question, Michael. I think what we saw with the COVID disruption in education was more just a function of I guess a rotting federalism that we've been waiting for. It's been building up for a long time. So many states did not have a plan, not just for a pandemic, but for any type of disruption. So many states did not have clear messages or consistent messages coming from the state. Again, I don't mean to make it about me, but I'm thinking about my own experience with my two kids when when they told us the schools were shutting down for 2 weeks, I was really confident and told my wife, I got this. It's not going to be a big deal. Anybody can do anything for 2 weeks. But that messaging really was not reflective of the reality. So I think we ended up in a place where in a lot of states, the school reopenings and school policies ended up in the courts, and that's no way to react nimbly to a situation that was changing on the ground. But I think that's a larger issue. To Paul and AJ's comments, it really, I go back to, do we have board members that know how to function cohesively as a group? If we're going to have democratically elected school boards, we need to be able to give these groups of 3, 5, 7 people the tools they need to understand how to function cohesively as a group, and to understand when they're not functioning cohesively as a group. And to spin it around back to what Robin had to say at the beginning, one of the challenges with the nationalization of our school board politics is that we're ceding the ground to those more cultural issues. Not that they're not important, or that there's not a place for them in school board, on school boards, or in their governing deliberations. There absolutely is. But if we are not clear about what the roles are of a school board member and what those governing goals are, in particular improving academic outcomes, we're ceding the space to let it be all about culture, and really have a politics that's focused on winning the cultural debate of the day, as opposed to the politics of governing, which is a longer term thing that eventually manifests itself, hopefully, in improved academic outcomes, or the negative side, right? Negative academic outcomes.
AJ, in your book, you talk about, I think it's toward the end of the book, districts' decisions around, or boards' decisions around hiring and sometimes firing their superintendents. This question isn't just for you, but I know you obviously have thoughts on this. How important is it for boards who are oftentimes elected and come in and have a superintendent sort of there that they didn't choose, unlike, say, a president who gets to appoint the folks that are going to carry out the president's agenda, or even a general manager or an athletic director at a university that gets to hire their coaches? Should school boards be, if they're going to rely on superintendents oftentimes to make critical decisions, is the most important decision for them to pick a superintendent and to be, I wouldn't say like quick to pull the trigger, but a lot more quick to make sure their superintendents align with their student-centered agenda that they want to carry out as their board's mission?
Yeah, part of the challenge here is if boards don't get clear about what the vision and value of the community are and codify those in a firm manner, and then use those as the sole tools for evaluating superintendent performance, then you actually incentivize the superintendent not to be in alignment. I think that's the bigger challenge that I see, is that boards are unintentionally encouraging their superintendent, incentivizing the superintendent not to be in alignment with the vision and values of the community. 1, because they didn't listen for it as a board, which is their job, not the superintendent's job. 2, because they didn't write it down and make it plain. And then 3, because they didn't use the community's vision and values as the sole basis for superintendent evaluation. When we get off on evaluating the superintendent, did the lunch, serve tacos on Thursday instead of Tuesday, or whatever it is, is this feel good things, did we like the superintendent? When those become the basis for superintendent evaluation, then we're actually incentivizing the superintendent to focus in on those things rather than focusing on the values of the community. The benefit of the board getting clear about the community's vision and values and then evaluating the superintendent on that is that actually slows down the rate of transition in what the district foci are. Because every time new board members come in, that can't be the occasion for completely throwing out the existing 5-year strategic plan and going in a different direction. But if that plan isn't grounded in something that the community's bought into, then there's actually an incentive to toss it out and start over again and just begin to churn. But if the board does the work first of really codifying, listening intently for what is it that is on the hearts of the community and putting that in a policy, and then having the superintendent be aligned to that, I've actually seen that you have a much greater likelihood of those policy decisions living across multiple shifts in board members. But if it feels like the focus of the superintendent should be whatever the board member of the moment says, then you have exactly what you described.
So I have a question for Robin here. Robin, Jason has posed this in the chat. He asks, do you think the expansion of school choice has inspired parents in traditional public schools to be more demanding of their boards and superintendents, so that the school choice movement is now fostering a feeling in the community that, look, we have a choice as to how our kids should be educated, and so parents are becoming more demanding? Or do you think it's the other way around? Do you think that it's a safety valve that the most opinionated people can leave the school system and go elsewhere?
I think it's more of the latter, in terms of when you have a pluralistic society and you have one governing council that oversees all schools that most kids go to, that puts a lot of pressure on one board to make everybody happy and to be the place where everybody's preferences are resolved or addressed. And choice, creates a little bit of a pressure valve around that potentially. We've certainly seen a lot of communities, rural communities in particular, where a group of really progressive parents decided, they were done with the kinds of board politics and the kinds of school offerings that they were offered, and that creating their own charter school allowed them the space to just, get their kids what they felt their kids wanted. And so, yeah, it can be a bit of a pressure valve, and whether that's a good thing or a bad thing long-term for democracy, I don't know. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing for kids is more my concern.
We have a question in the chat that asks, and this echoes one I think that also disappeared, which had to do with implementation, and it's very easy for boards to engage in cheap talk rather than follow through. But the questioner asks, are there examples of boards that actually take the risk with district leadership that's required to transform teaching and learning? So trying things that the questioner mentions, competency-based, informed by the science of learning, instead of the nostalgia of how things were done when they were a student in the school districts now as a board member. So can we think of any examples where board leadership is actually going squarely to the transformation of teaching and learning?
I mean, yes, I can share you a bunch of examples, but the one that comes to mind is Sun Prairie Area School District in Wisconsin. That's on my mind. I was just talking to them last week. But yeah, they've been very, I'd say over the past 10 years or so, making a series of curriculum changes based on a really strong board that had a lot of background on it. Now, I think there's some real, I guess, pressure from school board members who happen to have expertise in these areas when they ran. That's probably moving that along. I think there's also a urbanicity thing going on there. The places where I've seen it happen tend to be more sophisticated school districts, so larger numbers tend to be more affluent, where they might have the ability to hire staff or the willingness to hire staff that can kind of be a liaison with the school board, specifically working on curricular changes. But it probably is the exception, not the rule.
Well, you've talked about how the board needs to work it out behind the scenes, perhaps, and present a common consensus as to how to deal with things. It's one way to dial down the conflict. But we have a question here from Philip Jordan, who says it's very hard to do too much behind the scenes without violating open meeting laws. So there's all this freedom of information that's now required in so many states, if not nationwide. Can boards really function behind the scenes and develop a consensus, or is that no longer possible given the legal framework? Michael, you probably have a thought on that.
Yeah, this is being recorded, right? So I don't know if I need to say that there's just widespread violation of the open meeting laws going on in school boards, but I mean, it certainly occurs frequently. I do think that there is a there are tools, short of violating, obviously, open meetings laws, that can help facilitate this process. And some of it can be as simple as relationship building, right? Getting people together to talk about things that have nothing to do with school board business. When you do that, you're able to build relationships, build trust, build openness in a manner that doesn't have, a direct relationship to any specific item on a school board agenda. So you're not violating any laws, but you're still building that positive group dynamic. But I think the larger way you can do it is by educating new board members and having a strong onboarding process so they understand those limits of things like a walking quorum, where you're able to, or you can't go off and call a bunch of your board members and ask them how they're voting on something, but you can certainly tell them what you think of an item. Maybe it's not a conversation, but you can inform. So again, I think having a clear understanding or a clear onboarding process where folks know the legalities around their contact with their fellow board members, combined with the relationship of trust and ownership, can slowly build that culture where you're able to operate behind the scenes and basically know what one another are thinking, even if you're not asking them directly.
Yeah, in the same way that democracy doesn't select for competence, open meeting laws don't select for efficiency. That's not a design flaw, that's a feature of the system, is that essentially we've decided as a nation we do not trust our public officials. We would rather them be inefficient and conduct all of their business in public, accessible to the public, than take the risk of them doing anything behind scenes. This seems to be a across the board belief and comfort that is shared across every state I've worked in. And so to me, that just suggests what the public is saying is all those conversations shouldn't be hammered out behind the scenes. They should, in fact, be hammered out in the public view. And board members just have to adjust to that being the reality of the work.
What sort of model legislation or state level reforms do you think would be most promising to getting school board members and superintendents to put students first? I know one of you has already mentioned requiring school board members to have trainings that help emphasize for them the importance of putting student learning first. But in addition to that, I know, AJ, you mentioned in the book the idea of having automatic recalls, for example, if student achievement in a district falls below a certain point. But just sort of maybe each of you might, if you have an example of something that states could do, because otherwise I feel like we're relying on board members of their own volition to do the right thing and go to ask AJ to come into the district and help them get better. But what can we do on the front end to make sure the people that end up in these positions are more likely to carry that ethos of putting students first?
One other policy I'll offer: incentivize board members to get extensive training on effective governance before they file for office. You can't require it. We call it Jim Crow. That didn't work. We don't like that. But you can incentivize folks by saying there are requirements after you get elected, but you can get full credit for completing those requirements before you ever file. And that type of proactive training I've found is very helpful. Seeing people storm out of a training that's happening before filing day because we just explained to them that they don't get to, in fact, fire the coach themselves is actually a win for kids.
I don't know how I top that one, AJ. That's a great example. But the one thing I favor, Michael, is requiring every school board to adopt an accountability statement where they articulate in a sentence or two, like a mission statement, exactly how they define academic outcomes, how they define success, and how they expect to be held accountable for that. And it doesn't have to be complicated, but what it does is it forces, the board as a whole to deliberate and vote and accept on such a statement. And it also gives the public and the superintendent some documentation of how they can hold that board accountable. So it's not as I guess as dramatic as AJ says, clearing out the board when their academic outcomes fall, but it does engender some of that buy-in on the front end.
Well, as I hear all of the conversation, I find the group leaning on the trustee side of the trustee delegate divide over the proper role of school boards and representatives of the public in legislative situations. This was something that Edmund Burke talked about a couple hundred years ago, where he said, I'm a trustee for the whole people, and I'm going to use my best judgment to decide what is the right thing to do. Whereas other people think, no, it's the job of the representative, it's the job of the school board member to be a delegate, to represent the people, the community, the voices that are out there in the community. And I hear you basically all saying, I want the school boards to be trustees, not a group of delegates. Let's go around the table quickly, and each of you could each of you comment on that? Robin.
I mean, I think they're not delegates. They don't represent all of the views of the community. They represent oftentimes special interest views or their own personal agendas, things like that. So I think we need to face reality that, if we think that that's the job of school boards, they're not doing that job. So, they should be governing boards, and they are politically appointed. And so politics are going to come into it. But the more they can stay focused on the central task, which is teaching and learning, equity, effectiveness, and efficiency, got to get them there.
AJ.
The job of the board is to represent the vision and values of the community, not the wants and whims of individual community members.
And Michael.
That's very, very succinct there. I agree. I mean, I'd like to say that they could do both, but I think we have to remember school districts are special purpose governments. So we want them to represent the interests of the community, but they need to be solely focused on achieving the goals of that special purpose government, which is improving academic outcomes.
Well, with that, we shall turn it over to our listeners to talk about this issue among themselves. Thank you all very much for your engaging conversation and for your illumination of the conflict between communities and boards and their administrative staff. Thank you all very much.